Hello, my name is Hans Wildiers, and I was asked to give the European perspective on trial design in older adults. This is my disclosure slide. So I first want to highlight for those who are not aware that there is already a publication on endpoints and trial design in 2013 in GCO. It was a joint effort by the EORTC, the European Organization for Research and Treatment, by Alliance, the US group, and by SIOC, the International Society of Geriatric Oncology. So I want to discuss 3 trial designs with you where we had intense discussions. The first one is HER2-positive metastatic breast cancer first line in older adults. And for those familiar in the field, the standard first-line therapy for this disease is docetaxel or paclitaxel chemotherapy combined with trastuzumab and pertuzumab. But the big problem is that frail old persons will not be able to tolerate taxanes. And if you design a randomized study with this chemo arm in one of the arms, you will never include frail patients. Oncologists and patients will not be wanting to participate. So you are in a catch-22 situation. If you include such a standard arm, you don't get the frail patients. If you don't include it, you don't have a true control arm. And I don't think we can solve it. But for this study, we decided to go on with the 2 arms below, trastuzumab, pertuzumab alone, or the same combined with a gentle oral chemotherapy, metronomic cyclophosphamide. For the primary endpoint, because we were comparing 2 quite soft regimens, we decided only to focus on progression-free survival. But if you expect more intense differences in toxicity, for instance, I think you should go for combined or composite endpoints. But here we chose for PFS. And this study was published in the meanwhile, and it showed that if you add the metronomic cyclophosphamide to the dual HER2 blockade, that PFS seems longer, quite clinically relevant, but it was a randomized phase 2, not powered for solid conclusions. But what is remarkable about this publication is that we were able to include a true old population with a lot of frail patients, as you can see from the figure below. 70% had a G8 score, geriatric screening score 14 or lower. 52% were frail according to the S3P1 tool. So I think this is, if we would have included the third arm with taxanes, the population would have looked very different. The second trial I want to highlight is an adjuvant study. Here, the question is, how can we investigate the role of CDK4/6 inhibitors in luminal breast cancer in older persons? And could it replace chemotherapy? Well, the most clean design would be a randomized non-inferiority trial, adjuvant chemo, luminal high-risk breast cancer requiring chemo, adjuvant chemo followed by an aromatase inhibitor, or the CDK4/6 inhibitor instead of the chemo. It's the most clean design. You have the best comparison for distant disease-free survival and quality of life. You could design a co-primary endpoint for such a study, where distant disease-free survival is non-inferior, but quality of life is superior. But in an ideal world, we should do this type of trial, but it requires huge numbers of patients, thousands. And I think this is not feasible in general. So an alternative design could be a superiority design, where we ask the same question, but we create a composite endpoint. And this composite could consist of time to deterioration, which means the distant relapse or death without relapse or a decline in quality of life. The advantages are that superiority designs need less patients and you have feasible numbers, but there are strong limitations because how acceptable is the composite? Can you give the same value to a distant relapse or death to 10-point quality of life decline? And I think I can say that it is very difficult to find good composite endpoints in the adjuvant setting. In the metastatic setting, I will show you in the next study, there it is more feasible. But in adjuvant setting, it's very difficult. And that's why we finally decided to start a randomized but non-comparative phase 2 study. This was the only feasible. And it is a study that is similar to the APT trial in HER2-positive breast cancer. The primary endpoint is single arm. It's we set a bar for the number of distant relapses at 3 years with the experimental arm of endocrine therapy and CDK4/6 inhibition. We decided to go for the chemo control arm because we want an appropriate comparison. There are also very few historical data, but the primary analysis will be single arm. The third trial I want to mention is the FOCUS-2 trial in metastatic colorectal cancer. It's a trial that I love really a lot. It was a 2-by-2 design, asking 2 questions. Does the addition of oxaliplatin improve PFS? The answer in short was no. Does oral capecitabine improve quality of life compared with intravenous 5-FU? Short answer, no. But the most interesting to me is that they used a very nice composite endpoint, and this was overall treatment utility. And this consisted of several factors. First, and most important, the patient's view. They asked, after 3 months, do you think the therapy was worthwhile? Did you have an objective anti-cancer effect? What does the clinician think of it after 3 months? And was there objective toxicity? So overall treatment utility at 3 months, you have the advantage that you have a hindsight. Is the patient happy that he decided to have the treatment, and is the doctor happy? And then you can make categories. So you have a good overall treatment utility if the clinician is happy, the patient is happy, and there was no major toxicity. Or you have other categories depending on the problems that occur. And in that study, overall, about 40% mentioned a good overall treatment utility, but also 1/3 mentioned a poor or an intermediate overall treatment utility. So those were the 3 studies I wanted to discuss briefly. In my last slide, I just want to highlight one important message, because we often hear from scientific publications, mainly written by pharma, that new anti-cancer drugs are well tolerated and feasible for older patients. But I think this is not true and sometimes misleading information. Most of these registration trials, they don't recognize that the included population in those registration trials were a very selected fit population. And I think we can only conclude that anti-cancer drugs are tolerated in older patients and frail patients if frailty is measured and the toxicity according to frailty is measured. And in this paper, we provide concrete examples of where I think the reporting has been misleading. Thank you for your attention.